The Communist Party and the Auto Workers Union is very, very good, and I recommend it. And if you really just want an introduction to the history of the labor movement in the United States, and, you really ought to read this book, Labor's Untold Story. And this book, you'll see there, look at the logo on this book, UE. This is actually a book published by the United Electrical Workers Union, the UE. And it's like their manual. They give it to all their members to tell them what they're about as a labor union. And it's a beautiful, beautiful book, Labor's Untold Story. And it is an untold story because people don't seem to realize, it's funny. I'm from Ohio. I had grandparents, and, I would talk to my grandparents, and I remember when I was a kid, and I didn't, I was interested in communism, I was interested in politics, but I didn't ever, until I was, like, late high school, early college, I never thought to ask, but they would talk about the strikes. The strikes. At one time in the United States, organized labor was a very, very big deal. Truck drivers and meat packers and auto workers and steel workers going out there and fighting for their rights and having picket lines and doing very, very militant, radical things was part of everyday life in the United States. At one point, militant labor organizing was part of America. It was part of what it meant to be an American. Was you knew about people on strike, you knew about, unions, you knew about guys getting rough, you knew about the class struggle. You knew about workers versus bosses. You knew about that kind of thing. And I would hear my relatives, older folks, make reference to it. I would hear them talk about it. It's funny. I don't know if people saw, well, I'll get to it later, but, it used to be that knowledge of class struggle in day-to-day life was part of life. People were going on strike, demanding higher conditions. Those Teamsters, you didn't mess with those Teamsters. I remember hearing relatives say, oh, you didn't want to mess with the Teamsters. Those guys were tough guys. Militancy. And the class struggle in the United States was not peaceful and legal. Let's be real about it, folks. I'm not advocating anything here. Let me emphasize, I am not advocating anything here. I'm just going to talk about facts, right? You talk to any older person in the United States, they had a relative or a grandfather or a cousin or an uncle who was a Teamster or who was a UAW member or who was a meat packer or who was a steel worker, and they'll tell you stories about scabs, aka replacement workers, how they found out the bar where the scabs were working, and they went there with baseball bats and taught them not to mess with their livelihoods. That's common. You talk to older people. Now, it hasn't happened for 3, 4, 5 decades, but it was common at one point, right? I mean, you can talk to... I even remember when I was a kid in Ohio, there was a Frito-Lay factory, and I remember, this guy telling us about when they had strikes there, how the police were always would all of a sudden start giving people tickets when the strikes were going on. And they would start, giving, trying to give people tickets to keep them away from the picket line. It was, I remember this, and that when factory production existed in the United States in big apparatus, big numbers, there was a lot of, picket line stuff, right? And, people being tough, and people scuffling. And it's funny. Nowadays, let's speak hypothetically. Let's say one of these UAW workers on the picket line, somebody was trying to cross the picket line, some replacement worker or scab was trying to cross the picket line, and a UAW worker, a father with kids, with a wife and kids, punches him and gets arrested. What would the response be? Well, the response of his union would be to immediately denounce him and say, wow, we do not promote assaults and lawless activity. The union would denounce him. His wife and kids would say, oh my God, our father's a thug. He's a violent criminal, and they would just be ashamed to be associated with him. Right? That's what would happen. I mean, the UAW leadership, the unions themselves, they don't condone that kind of activity. And the community itself doesn't condone that kind of activity. That would be completely unacceptable. If some auto worker in Michigan or Ohio threw a punch on the picket line, his family members, his union leadership would say, oh my gosh, they would be ashamed of his behavior. However, 40 years ago, that was not the case. 40 years ago, if you'd been in Detroit, you'd been in Ohio, you'd been in Kentucky, you'd been in one of these places, and somebody threw a punch on the picket line and got arrested for it, all of his union brothers would pile into the court hearing. That's our brother. Wow. Not only was he standing with his brothers, but he threw a punch for us. And his wife and kids would think, wow, our father loves us so much that he's risking going to jail just to make sure that he can get, the money, can get a decent pay enough to take care of his kids. The attitude, the community attitude, not just toward unions, but toward labor militancy, toward people roughing it up on the picket line, was a lot different. In the community, in neighborhoods, it was considered an honorable, respectable thing. Now, again, not advocating anything here, but I'm just telling you. There was a time where it was considered, if you were an auto worker and you punched a scab or a replacement worker, there was a time where that was considered to be, you were doing what had to be done, you were sticking up for your wife and kids, you were sticking up for your brothers on the line, you were doing something good. Now, the attitude is completely different. Completely different attitude. People want to talk about, okay, well, that organized labor has just been weakened in the United States. That's part of it. That's part of what's going on. You're right. Organized labor has been weakened in the United States. There's no question about that. But there's another factor here, which is that, in a lot of ways, our culture in the United States and in a lot of Western countries has changed. I mean, there's a lot less violence in everyday life, for one. People don't get into fistfights on the street. You talk to older folks, they'll tell you about, I used to hang out with anti-war activists, older, hippie kind of anti-war activists, people who'd been activists in the 70s. And they would talk about how when there'd be a peace rally against the Vietnam War, right-wingers would come and fight. And they would fight back. And there would be scuffles between the anti-war protesters and the pro-war protesters. And no one ever got arrested and no one called the police because it was considered dishonorable to do so. It was like an honor code, right? We don't call the police, right? If the pro-war guys called the police, that meant they were wimps. They weren't tough. And if the anti-war guys called the police, they were working with the man and they were working with the establishment. And so in New York City, in Chicago, in Cleveland, if there was an anti-war rally, some pro-war people came, they'd throw a couple punches, the anti-war people would throw a couple punches, and everyone would just kind of go home, and that was that. Nowadays, people go to jail for that kind of thing. And the laws haven't really changed either. The laws haven't changed. It was illegal in the 50s and 60s and 70s to assault someone. It was illegal. But the attitude of society toward it has changed. There's a lot less violence in everyday life. And that's interesting to me. It accompanies kind of a change in how we view things at schools, for example. When I was a kid, I've said this on lives before, I will confess that as an 8th grader, I did get into a fist fight at school and was suspended from school. I hope I haven't lessened your all's opinion of me. I hope you don't think I'm a ruffian and a thug. But a long time ago, when I was a student in Ohio, in 8th grade, I got into a fist fight, And that was kind of, I was suspended from school for it. It was just kind of, it happened. I was definitely not the only kid at my school to have gotten into a fist fight. It happened. That kind of thing happened among high school, junior high aged young men. That was just kind of, it happened, right? But, things started changing. And I was in a very remote rural part of the United States. Things had already changed in a lot of parts, but they were gradually changing, right? After the Columbine massacre of 1999, that massacre was widely blamed in the public consciousness on bullying. Interestingly enough, right? 1999, horrendous massacre in the United States. These two young men. I don't even remember Dylan something, and I don't even remember the Eric Harris. I think. Well, anyway, whatever. These two murderers showed up at their high school and killed a bunch of their classmates. 1999, and it was all over the media after that happened that these young men had been members of something called the Trench Coat Mafia, and that they had been victims of bullying, and that they were shooting those who had bullied them. And we learned later, and you can look at this, I mean, even CNN and others have done a story about, everything you thought you knew about Columbine was wrong. Number one, they were not bullied. They were not bullied. In fact, one of the murderers was himself a bully. So they were not bullied. They were not responding to bullying, number one. Number two, they were not part of a trenchcoat mafia. There was a group of kids at the school who called themselves the Trenchcoat Mafia, but the only time that these two shooters had ever been wearing trench coats was on the day that they committed their murder. Right? And that was to cover up their weapons. So there was no Trenchcoat Mafia, and these two guys were not victims of bullying. And they did not listen to Marilyn Manson's rock and roll music. They didn't. They apparently liked a German band called Rammstein, but they did not listen to Marilyn Manson. But I'll tell you, immediately after the Columbine massacre, I was told these kids were victims of bullying. They shot all the bullies, and they were in a trenchcoat mafia, and they listened to Marilyn Manson. They didn't do any of those things. It was malarkey. What everyone was told, what everyone heard on CNN, was fake news. It was fake news. It was all fake news. But based on this fake news, there was a whole lot of reforms. And I remember my school, we had a new principal one year, and he said, I have a new attitude toward fighting. I remember this. He said, my attitude toward fighting, and thank God my fight had been before this, he said, my attitude toward fighting is there is no self-defense. There is no self-defense in school. Right? If you fight, if you throw a punch at this school, you've committed assault, and you're out for 2 weeks. And that's how most schools do it nowadays, right? A bully punches you, you put your arms up and scream, teacher, help me, the bully just punched me. That's all you can do. Children are being taught, that used to be the whole thing. It's like we've all seen the TV shows, right, about bullying, right? And there's the kid and the father or big brother figure teaches them to fight back, and he finally fights the bully. It's the client. That's illegal now. That don't happen no more, right? Now, in the United States, no fighting, period. You punch back, you're in just as much trouble as the person who instigated the situation. That's U.S. culture now. And what does that lead to? Well, that leads to a situation where people are being kind of taught that rather than advocating for themselves, if they are facing a hostile situation, they need to turn to authorities. And that's another thing we've seen. Whereas before, kids were getting in fistfights in school all the time. They were punished for it. You can't have that. But it wasn't. Now, there are police all over schools. And when kids get into fistfights, they go to jail. U.S. culture is changing. We don't have sporadic violence in everyday life, right? But at the same time, we have police everywhere. We have people going to jail a lot more. And in situations like this UAW strike, you can bet there's not labor militancy going on. There aren't people with, there aren't UAW workers going out with baseball bats. That's not happening. It's not happening. I mean, U.S. culture has changed. It has changed a lot. I'm just saying. And it's important to think about. And the libertarian crowd, and I mean, I'm sure they love to talk about this, right? And this is setting up the police state. This is dependency on the nanny state, right? This is weakening individuals, right? You take the guns away from individuals. You put all the guns in the hands of the police. You make people, this is standard conversation talking point for libertarians. They love this. But it has implications for the left as well. It does. It has implications for those of us who, trust me, okay? Again, not advocating anything here, but just saying, do you think that we in the United States would have ever had the good paying jobs in the UAW if somebody hadn't thrown a punch? Read Communists in the Auto Workers Union. Read Labor's Untold Story. The class struggle in the United States has been quite bloody, and a lot of intense things have happened. I think it was the Spartacist League, that weird Trotskyite sect. They had a bumper sticker. It had a picture of a baseball bat, and it said, "When labor plays hardball, workers win." When labor plays hardball, workers win. These things happen, and it's weird. U.S. culture has changed, and we're in a strange world. When I think about these UAW guys on the line and what a strike means now versus what a strike meant in the 30s or what a strike meant in the 50s, there's a big difference there. And of course, violence in everyday life is not a good thing. Right? We don't want, domestic violence is a horrendous thing. Bullying is a horrendous thing. It leads to children, being in awful situations and committing suicide and being afraid to go to school. And, these things, we try to fix a problem, but often when you fix a problem, you create new problems. That's part of life. And it's interesting to reflect on that. And when I think about those guys on the picket line, GM's losing a lot of money because of this strike, and these strikers have their demands, and think about it though. It's worth thinking about. And that leads me to something that I'm going to say, but I'll preface it first of all. Toxic masculinity is a problem, okay? And this is the preface. Okay, I lived in an all-men's dorm for a couple semesters of college, and trust me, yes, there is a such thing as toxic masculinity when too many young men are together and there are no women and they're young men and they're athletic. My college dorm that was all men was right across from the football field. Yes, there is a such thing as toxic masculinity, and yes, toxic masculinity can be a problem. I remember I toured another college. I think it was Cleveland State University. We were touring the dorms. And they said, we have women's dorms and we have mixed dorms. And I asked, why don't you have all men's dorms? And they said, because we don't like the furniture being broken. The furniture bills were too high. So, yes, okay, so there is a such thing as toxic masculinity. People talk about, the mass shooters all seem to be male. Fact, not disagreeing with that. However, masculinity is not a problem. And I'm going to get flack for saying that. Yes, toxic masculinity, bullying, homophobia, violent crime, things that are considered masculine, that are also criminal, that are also oppressive, that's a problem. Masculinity itself is not a problem. Okay? And I'm going to get flack for saying that. I know that. But whoever sent this memo out, that masculinity itself is a problem, is wrong. They're wrong. They're just simply wrong. The notion that it is wrong to act in ways that are considered to be male is wrong. It's wrong. I'm just telling you, right? It's just basic biology. Okay? In order to create a baby, you need a sperm and an egg, right? You need masculinity to exist in some form. Right? Even that ContraPoints agrees with me on this. Come on. The notion that masculinity itself is bad is outrageously wrong. And I'm just telling you that. I'm telling you the fact that the notion that masculinity in and of itself. Not toxic masculinity, not bullying, not sexism, not discrimination, not homophobia, not... No, no, no. But the notion that masculinity is wrong is an incorrect notion. That is an incorrect notion. It is an incorrect notion, and it's getting weird. You know, it's getting very, very weird. I watch a lot of YouTube, and it seems like I watch, Bernie Sanders supporting YouTube channels, and all the guys who do it, it's like they're afraid to do anything that might look masculine. Look at old socialist literature. Read The Grapes of Wrath. Tom Joad is the leftist ideal of the 1930s. And he's a masculine man, right? Wherever someone's, hungry, I'll be there, right? He's a masculine man. Thank you, Sharon Pitts. You look at the old Soviet, communist cartoons. Big, brawny worker with a hammer. He's a masculine man. There's nothing inherently wrong with masculinity. There are things that are masculine that are wrong. Sure, I'll give you that. But this notion that left-wing people should not be masculine, that if you are left-wing, you should act as effeminate as possible, that's not true. Now, another thing I will point out is that what is masculinity? What is masculinity? That's a good question. Culturally, it's very different. Great example, right? I'm from Ohio. In Ohio, where I grew up, it's considered to be rather effeminate to be concerned about how you dress. And so when I first moved to New York City, I did not pay any attention to how I dressed because I didn't want people, I was brought up, don't pay attention to your clothes. When I came to New York City, in New York City, it is very possible to be a very masculine man and to be very concerned about one's physical appearance. It's a cultural difference. Another example, right? The Mormons, right? Look at those Mormon guys. You ever knock on your door, those Mormon guys, I would like to get you a copy of the Book of Mormon. They think they're very masculine, right? I mean, and it's a very patriarchal, the father is the head of the household. It's a very conservative male religion, traditional gender roles, but they're all combing their hair to get it perfectly nice. They're all smiling all the time. They're all really well learned about their religion. They're things that in some cultures within the USA are considered to be quite effeminate. Right? I mean, if you look at the way the Mormons are, the way Mormon men act, where they always smile, right? The way that they comb their hair constantly and their hair is always slicked back and looking really nice. The way that they don't swear and the way Mormon men conduct themselves, in the culture I grew up in Ohio, that would be considered to be very feminine. But for them, it's very masculine. I mean, masculinity, what it means to act male, is different wherever you go in the world. You go to Asia, their idea of what being masculine is different. You go to the Middle East, their notion of masculine is different. In Europe, it's different. What does it mean to be masculine? There's no clear answer to that. And maybe some of the way we understand masculinity needs to be changed. That I'll give you. Right? There's a lot of things about the culture that are problematic. But this notion that masculinity itself is the problem is wrong. It's just wrong, number one, and it's a dead end. Because as long as the human race exists, there are going to be masculine men. There are going to be males. There are going to be XY chromosomes. And this notion on the left that, men are the problem, people acting male are the problem, I'm telling you folks, it's wrong and it's a dead end, right? Criticize sexism, sure. Criticize bullying, sure. Criticize toxic masculinity. Criticize, athletic culture. Criticize bullying. But this notion that masculinity itself is the problem is wrong. Forgive me. And I'm sure, I've offended a bunch of people, and I'm at the point where I don't care. If I was trying to win an award for being the most in line with the progressive liberal party line, I would have been living my life completely differently. I'm here to tell you what I think. I'm here to tell you the facts. I am here to, give you a perspective, and I'm just telling you how I see it. I'm telling you how I see it, right? So there you go.